Welcome to another video on military science. Today we're analyzing the concept of breakthrough, and it's a follow-up to the video on firepower, and it aims to analyze the ways, means, what's important, what's not important, and the various schools of war on their approach on breakthrough. Now, going into the video, a parenthesis here, the video is generally for generalized concepts of war. I'm not getting that much into detail to try to keep it as simplistic as possible. First of all, we should never forget the concept of why we are attacking, and that is to break and destroy the enemy force, as von Clausewitz said. If you are just attacking for the sake of attacking, you're just going to have the Battle of the Somme. Millions and millions of deaths. So the first important thing, reconnaissance. Why should you have a very important reconnaissance? If the enemy is holding in very good defensive positions, which you do not know that they exist, then the moment that you actually attack, even if you manage to break the line, what percentage of your force will still be alive? How much organization are you going to have left to be able to exploit your breakthrough? And thus, reconnaissance is very vital to know what you are expecting and if you are actually able to penetrate such force. Now, firepower, or just testing of the enemy positions, is the second step. This can happen both with direct artillery, air power, and any other means of firepower to soften the positions as for you to be able to break them later, or use light infantry to test those positions. This is a testing of how well your reconnaissance is, as well as destroying those positions to be more effective in the later stages. This step can be skipped if you have absolute surprise. But this is rarely occurs, and it does occur in situations where the war has just begun. In already existing wars where it's ongoing, having complete surprise, it's not really easily achieved, and what you truly aim for is shock. And as we mentioned last time, firepower plays a very vital role in applying that shock. And the shock effect will get multiplied as your attack becomes better and better and better, and the enemy gets more and more disorganized. The firepower, it also includes the idea of infantry assaulting those positions to be sure that your reconnaissance is right, as well as being able to test how strong they are. This phase, though, shouldn't last long, because even that small amount of surprise you have, you don't want to lose it. And then we move to the second phase, which is the actual assault. Now, the assault can happen both directly using tanks or a combination of tanks and infantry. It really depends on the school of war. Helicopters, whatever. It's the idea that you use the vast majority of your attacking forces now fully engaged on the enemy with a pure goal of achieving a breakthrough, a piercing of the enemy positions. Once you manage to achieve that is when we move to the breakthrough or piercing phase. If you don't manage to achieve that and you just dislodge the enemy from their positions, but they are able to withdraw to a bit better defensive positions, and you don't really have a clear opening, then you cannot move to the breakthrough phase. You are still in the assault phase. In the Battle of the Somme, for example, where there were millions of deaths, they had reconnaissance, which was bad. They had firepower that took way too long and was way too ineffective. They did assault, they did gain some ground, but they didn't achieve a breakthrough. Moving a bit the front line is not breakthrough. And that's something fundamentally people don't understand. Breakthrough means completely disorganizing a unit and having a hole there. Now, moving to the breakthrough phase. The breakthrough phase is where you just barely manage to achieve an opening on the enemy defenses, and then you move in and establish that opening. That will imply that no one is directly defending on the other side, but only on the flanks, or at least only on one flank. Once you achieve that breakthrough and you manage to move a force through that point, then we move to the exploitation phase. Again, in many situations, you may be able to achieve breakthrough, you might be able to move some troops in, but if you are not able to move them fast enough, keep organized enough, and move fast enough, and the enemy is able to respond and bring defenses, then your breakthrough has completely failed and you cannot move to the last phase. And the last phase is the most important one, is exploitation, how you take advantage of that breakthrough. And here is where the different school of thoughts completely diverge on their approach of war. Now, here, before we move on, armor is the key when it comes to breakthrough, along with air power. So without air power, it's really hard to have an exploitation phase and a breakthrough phase, as well as continuous air support, artillery, missiles, and so forth. Those act as multipliers to your actual assault units, which have to have armor and have to be mobile, and communication, of course. Now, let's, for example, now move on to the Russian School of War. The idea of the Russian School of War, to give you a pure example, is where you have a big concentration of troops. For example, you're Russia, you have a lot of troops. Your troops are really of bad quality. The enemy has fewer troops than you, but they are of a much better quality than yours. And you have these economies of concentration. That means you have way too many troops concentrated at one point, while the enemy has few troops in defensive positions, which means they can hold your line for much longer, because the defendant always has the advantage. The idea of the Russian School of War is firstly to, yes, use air power, reconnaissance, all that, but the main idea is that the assault comes in first on multiple points on the front, and the moment the line starts to break, that's where they use their armor units, for example, these will be the armor units, to actually throw in at those positions, break the line, so establish the breakthrough, and once the breakthrough has been established, the exploitation phase of the Russian school aims of expanding the line as much as possible, so to take advantage of your numerical superiority over the enemy, and for the enemy to be much harder for him to cover that vast land. So the idea is to push through in and push in and establish a line really big, and push your troops in. Secondly, the Russians' approach to war is the breakthrough point to be truly, after the exploitation happens, the breakthrough point to be enlarged as much as possible. So counterattacks, continuous attacks on those points on multiple sides to be able to establish a much larger force of piercing. So to look something like this. And then to just move on multiple directions to be able to expand the line as much as possible, so the enemy will be unable to literally catch up with you to defend, and if they do, they will be so spread out as to unable to actually maintain those positions. Now that's the Russian idea of war, and we can see here, for example, Operation Uranus, which here the breakthrough happened, here, and as you can see, the idea is to expand the line as much as possible, and while doing so, of course, establishing an encirclement. All of the army will want to establish an encirclement. It's not only the German school that does so, just the German school prefers to do so because of their way they fight. The Russians are harder to establish a breakthrough, but the idea is to establish a much bigger one breakthrough. But the idea to expand the line as much as possible and spread the enemy thin. Now, moving on to the German approach to war, which is vastly different in the concept that you have some really good troops, some good concentration, good reconnaissance, good air power, very important in the German School of War, good communication between those units. And the idea is that once you are able to break that line, you rely on individual officers' initiative to really understand what's going on the battlefield, have the freedom to make their own choices, and then push in as fast as possible. Mobility is key, because mobility in the German School of War is the idea that you completely disorganize the high command of the enemy to the point that they have no idea where you actually are, that even if they do have the forces to actually hold your line, because of that lack of information, they're going to get disseminated and you're going to force them to move away from very good defensive positions because of that panic. And the idea is that you use mechanized forces for defense to cover a very long area of line, while your armor forces maintain some sort of concentration, so a punch that continues the assault to complete a vast encirclement. Your infantry slowly moves in, but what plays the most important role in many cases is actually the mechanized forces that are responsible on maintaining that line of force, so maintaining that breakthrough. So the enemy won't be able to establish, cut off your own forces. And to achieve that, not only do you need pretty good mechanized forces, you need good air superiority. So you take the advantage of air power and of the defensive while being on the offensive. So your armored troops break the line, your mechanized troops move in, they capture some key very strong positions, you let the other guys counterattack, you use your defensive positions to cause as many casualties as possible, and then your mechanized forces immediately counterattack on the open field, and you use your armor advantage over them to overrun them, push them back, and then retreat to a position where you are waiting to counterattack again while holding some strong positions, so some villages, some hills, and so forth. The idea is to hold as possible until the infantry comes in and you can move forward to do the same while your armored troops are continuing the exploitation. And we see this, the example, for example, in Operation Barbarossa in the Northern Front, where they break the enemy lines, the infantry establishes an encirclement, the mechanized forces maintain this defensive line, while the armored units move in to continue assaulting any possible new units coming in to be able to achieve the encirclement which they wish for. And that's why the German School of War aims for such encirclements. The idea is speed, don't care about casualties, and as Rommel said, the best general is the one that enters into combat knowing already how many casualties he will take prior to the battle. So the protection of human life is not in the centerpiece of that School of War, but in contrast to the Russians, it does matter a bit. So the Russian approach to war, they don't really they completely neglect human lives. Now, let's see, for example, a failed scenario of a breakthrough. So this is, as I mentioned prior, you have the firepower phase, you throw in your assault, you barely manage to break through the enemy lines, but then using constant counterattacks, delays your forces, bringing more reinforcements on new defensive positions. So once your armor units actually reach that point, they are so much weaker, so this is a strength level, they are so much demoralized that they are unable to push further. You have already suffered a lot of casualties, and at that point, as the attackers are so vulnerable that you, as the Battle of Kursk shows, and this is where it's taken from, it's quite disastrous. So the German school is, in many cases, can be argued all or nothing approach to war. Massive concentrations break in, but if you don't manage to exploit, then this is the consequences. Massive armor losses, the enemy always uses the advantage of the defense, and as a result, you always get to get disseminated. Now, this has been the very basic introduction to the concept of breakthrough in Ware. If you want more details, please do tell me. I'll try to get it as simple as possible. And there's going to be an accompanied video to this showing an example of a blitzkrieg assault, and the videos will be launched together so you can see them one after the other. Thank you very much. Like, subscribe, and have a good night.